Hello, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling to a forgotten chapter of history, to the summer of 1631, when a small Irish village called Baltimore faced an unimaginable terror. Under the cover of darkness, pirates from across the sea arrived, leaving the community forever changed. This is a story of fear, betrayal, and survival that might just keep you awake tonight. Let's get started. The Mediterranean Sea, in the early 17th century, was a world divided, a battleground between empires and faiths. To understand how North African pirates came to raid a remote Irish village, we must first travel to the shores of North Africa, where the states of Barbary had risen to prominence as maritime powers feared throughout Europe. These were not lawless bands of rogues, but organized states operating with the blessing of powerful empires, conducting what they saw as legitimate warfare against Christian Europe. The term Barbary referred to the coastal regions of North Africa, spanning what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. By the early 17th century, these territories had developed into semi-autonomous states, operating under the loose suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks had emerged from Anatolia to conquer Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and establishing themselves as a formidable power straddling Europe and Asia. By the 16th century, their empire stretched from Hungary to Mesopotamia, from the Crimea to the Nile. The Ottomans had extended their influence across North Africa, but their control was tenuous. In practice, the Barbary states operated with considerable independence. Algiers, the most powerful of these states, had become the center of Mediterranean piracy. Its rulers styled themselves as Dais or Bais, while maintaining nominal allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan. Similar arrangements existed in Tunis and Tripoli. Morocco remained fully independent, ruled by its own dynasties, but participated enthusiastically in the same maritime activities. These North African states had developed a unique economic and political system centered on maritime raiding, known as corso, a form of state-sanctioned privateering. The corsairs who conducted these raids were not mere pirates, but privateers operating with official commissions. Their captains held military ranks, their crews were organized along military lines, and their activities were regulated by the state. The distinction between piracy and privateering was crucial in the early modern period. Pirates were stateless criminals, while privateers were licensed agents of a sovereign power. For the Barbary states, the corso was not merely a profitable enterprise, but a vital component of their economies and political systems. The rulers granted licenses to corsair captains, provided them with ships and supplies, and received a substantial portion of the proceeds from their raids. The corsairs brought in tremendous wealth through the capture of European ships, the seizure of valuable cargo, and most profitably, the enslavement of Christian captives who could be ransomed or sold. Religious ideology underpinned this system. The corsairs viewed themselves as ghazis, warriors engaged in jihad against the Christian powers that had driven Muslims from Spain and threatened Islamic lands. The Reconquista of Spain had culminated in 1492 with the fall of Granada, followed by the forced conversion or expulsion of Muslims and Jews. Many fled to North Africa, bringing with them bitter memories and a desire for revenge against Christian Spain and its allies. This religious dimension transformed what might have been mere piracy into a form of holy war. The corsairs targeted Christian shipping and coastal settlements across the Mediterranean, from Spain and Italy to Greece and the Black Sea. But they were not indiscriminate in their attacks. Muslim vessels and the ships of nations with treaties with the Barbary states were generally spared. This selective targeting reinforced the religious nature of their enterprise. The Mediterranean had long been a contested space between Christian and Muslim powers. The naval battle of Lepanto in 1571 where a coalition of Christian states defeated an Ottoman fleet, had temporarily checked Ottoman naval expansion. But the Barbary corsairs continued to thrive, adapting their tactics to the changing political landscape. By the early 17th century, they had extended their operations beyond the Mediterranean, venturing into the Atlantic to raid the coasts of Portugal, Spain, France, England, and eventually Ireland. The corsairs' ships were perfectly designed for their purpose. Their main vessels were galleys, powered by both sail and oars. These sleek, maneuverable craft could outrun heavier European sailing ships in light winds and navigate shallow coastal waters where larger vessels could not follow. The corsairs also adopted European ship designs, particularly the Dutch flute, which they modified to suit their needs. By the 17th century, many corsair captains commanded sailing ships that could venture far into the Atlantic, weathering its rough conditions. Their crews were as diverse as the Mediterranean world itself. The corps was composed of Muslims from various backgrounds: native Berbers, Arabs, Turks, and European converts to Islam. Many of these converts were former captives who had turned Turk, embracing Islam either out of conviction or to escape the harsh conditions of slavery. Christian slaves, captured in previous raids, provided the labor for the oars. European renegades, who had abandoned their homelands for various reasons, brought valuable nautical skills and knowledge of European waters. Among the most feared corsair captains was Murat Reis, the younger, born Jan Jansoen, in the Dutch town of Haarlem around 1570. As a young man, he had been a privateer for the Dutch Republic in its struggle against Spain. Captured by corsairs around 1618, he converted to Islam and joined their ranks. Rising quickly through skill and daring, he became admiral of the corsair fleet of Salé, a pirate republic on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. His intimate knowledge of European shipping, combined with his bold leadership, made him a formidable enemy to Christian shipping. Murat Reis was not unique. Other European renegades had risen to prominence among the corsairs. The most notorious was Simon Danseker, known as Simon the Dancer, a Dutchman who terrorized Mediterranean shipping before being executed in 1611. Another was Ivan Durkee de Veenboer, known as Suleiman Reis, who had been a Dutch privateer before converting to Islam. These men brought European navigational knowledge and tactics to the corsair fleets, making them even more dangerous. The economic impact of Barbary raiding was enormous. By the early 17th century, the corsairs were capturing hundreds of European ships annually. The Spanish monarchy estimated that between 1613 and 1621, the Algerians alone took 447 ships and enslaved 7,000 people. The economic losses extended beyond the captured vessels and cargoes. Maritime insurance rates skyrocketed for voyages in corsair-infested waters. Coastal regions were depopulated as inhabitants fled inland to escape raids, leading to agricultural decline. Slavery was the most lucrative aspect of the corsair economy. The corsairs were selective in their taking of captives. They prioritized young men who could work, women who might serve in domestic roles or harems, and children who could be raised as Muslims. The elderly, the sick, and the poor were often left behind as they had little value in the slave markets. Skilled workers like carpenters, blacksmiths, and shipwrights commanded higher prices, as did educated individuals who might be ransomed for substantial sums. Upon arrival in North Africa, captives were paraded through the streets to the slave markets. There, they were inspected like livestock, with buyers examining their teeth, muscles, and overall health. The most valuable captives became the property of the Dai or Bey, the ruler of the state. Others were purchased by private individuals for domestic service, agricultural labor, or work in construction. The strongest men often ended up as galley slaves, chained to the oars of corsair vessels in conditions of extreme hardship. For the Barbary states, the ransom industry became a sophisticated enterprise. Specialized merchants called ransomers negotiated the release of captives, charging substantial fees for their services. Religious orders like the Trinitarians and Mercedarians raised funds across Europe to redeem Christian captives. These orders maintained representatives in the Barbary ports, negotiating prices and arranging transportation for freed slaves. The costs were enormous, both in financial terms and human suffering. By the early 17th century, the European powers had developed various strategies to deal with the corsair threat. The most direct approach was naval action. Spanish, Venetian, French, and English fleets periodically bombarded corsair ports or engaged their ships at sea. These punitive expeditions sometimes achieved temporary success, but rarely had lasting impact. The corsairs simply waited for the European fleets to depart before resuming their activities. A more pragmatic approach was treaty making. Many European states negotiated agreements with the Barbary regencies, paying annual tributes in exchange for immunity from attack. These arrangements were costly and often unreliable, as the corsairs frequently violated terms when convenient. England secured a treaty with Morocco in 1622 that provided some protection for its shipping, but English vessels remained vulnerable to corsairs from other Barbary states. The third approach was ransom and redemption. European governments, religious orders, and private individuals raised vast sums to redeem captives. This system, while providing relief for some, inadvertently fueled the corsair economy by making human captives even more valuable. Some states established dedicated funds for the redemption of their subjects. Others incorporated redemption provisions into peace treaties with the Barbary regencies. For most European powers, the Barbary threat was primarily a Mediterranean concern. But by the early 17th century, corsair captains like Murat Reis were extending their operations into the Atlantic. Their targets now included the coastlines of Portugal, Spain, France, and even England. These bold raids struck terror into coastal communities unaccustomed to such threats. Reports of corsair attacks filled European newspapers and pamphlets, creating a climate of fear that extended far beyond the Mediterranean. The corsairs' tactics evolved to meet these new challenges. Operating far from their home ports, they needed to maximize the efficiency of their raids. They gathered intelligence about potential targets through networks of informants, including European renegades familiar with their home regions. They studied the patterns of coastal trade, identifying vessels that followed predictable routes, and they learned to strike swiftly at undefended coastal settlements, carrying off captives before local defenses could be mobilized. Murat Reis exemplified this new breed of corsair captain. His experience as a Dutch privateer had given him intimate knowledge of Atlantic navigation and European coastal defenses. He established a base at Salé, ideally positioned for raids into the Atlantic. From there, he led expeditions that ranged as far north as Iceland, capturing vessels and raiding coastal settlements. His knowledge of European languages and customs made him particularly dangerous, as he could pass as a European merchant until the moment of attack. The extension of corsair activity into northern waters had profound implications. Regions that had considered themselves safe from Mediterranean conflicts suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The psychological impact was enormous, creating a sense that nowhere was truly secure. Communities along the Atlantic seaboard hastily improved their defenses, building watchtowers and coastal fortifications. Local militia forces were reorganized to respond more quickly to raids. The political landscape of Europe contributed to the corsairs' success. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, had engulfed the continent in a complex web of conflicts, diverting resources and attention from maritime defense. England and France were intermittently at war, preventing effective cooperation against the corsair threat. Spain, despite its powerful navy, was overextended with commitments in the Mediterranean, the Netherlands, and the Americas. These divisions created opportunities that the corsairs expertly exploited. In this context, isolated and relatively undefended regions like the southern coast of Ireland became tempting targets. Ireland in the early 17th century was under English rule but inadequately protected. The English government, focused on more pressing concerns, had neglected the defense of Ireland's extensive coastline. Local authorities lacked the resources to maintain effective coastal watches or response forces. Small fishing communities scattered along the coast were particularly vulnerable. For Murat Rise and his corsair fleet, such communities represented ideal targets. They could be approached under cover of darkness, with little risk of encountering naval patrols. Their small populations could be quickly subdued with minimal resistance. And while individual captives might not command high ransoms, the total value of dozens of slaves would make the raid worthwhile. These calculations would lead Murat Rise to the Irish coast in the summer of 1631, setting the stage for one of the most audacious corsair raids in European history. The religious dimension of the conflict added another layer of complexity. For the corsairs, attacking Christian communities was not merely profitable, but spiritually meritorious. Similarly, for their victims, capture by Barbary Turks represented not only enslavement but the terrifying prospect of forced conversion to Islam. The threat to both body and soul magnified the horror of corsair raids in the Christian imagination, feeding a rich tradition of captivity narratives that emphasized the religious perils of Islamic slavery. As Murad Rise and his fleet sailed north in 1631, they carried with them this complex legacy of religious conflict, economic opportunism, and political calculation. Their target would be a small fishing village on the southern coast of Ireland, far from the Mediterranean world that had shaped their enterprise. What happened there would enter the annals of Irish history as a singular tragedy, a moment when the far-reaching tendrils of Mediterranean conflict suddenly and violently intruded into the lives of ordinary people on the Atlantic fringe of Europe. To understand how a North African corsair fleet came to target a small Irish fishing village, we must turn our attention to Ireland itself. The Ireland of 1631 was a land of profound transformation, its ancient Gaelic social order yielding painfully to English conquest and colonization. Under the rule of the early Stuart monarchs, Ireland had become a laboratory for new forms of colonial governance, with policies that would reshape its demographic, religious, and political landscape for centuries to come. The English conquest of Ireland had been a long and bloody process, beginning with the Anglo-Norman invasions of the 12th century. For centuries, English control had been limited to the area around Dublin, known as the Pale. Beyond its boundaries, Gaelic lords maintained varying degrees of independence, acknowledging English sovereignty when expedient, but governing according to their own traditions. This unstable arrangement persisted until the Tudor era, when England embarked on a systematic campaign to extend its authority throughout the island. The 9 Years' War, 1593 to 1603, marked the final resistance of the old Gaelic order, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Hugh Roe O'Donnell. Irish forces initially achieved impressive victories against English troops, but the crushing Irish defeat at Kinsale in 1601, followed by the submission of O'Neill in 1603, effectively ended organized Gaelic resistance. The flight of the Earls in 1607, when O'Neill and other Gaelic aristocrats fled to continental Europe, created a power vacuum that the English crown was eager to fill. King James I, who had succeeded Elizabeth I in 1603, initiated a new phase in Ireland's colonization through the policy of plantation. This involved the confiscation of land from Irish owners and its redistribution to loyal English and Scottish settlers. The most extensive of these schemes was the Plantation of Ulster, begun in 1609, which dramatically transformed the demographic and religious character of Northern Ireland. Similar, smaller plantations were established in Munster, Leinster, and parts of Connacht. The stated aims of plantation were to civilize Ireland and secure it against rebellion by introducing a loyal Protestant population. In practice, the policy created a deeply divided society. The native Irish, predominantly Catholic, were displaced from their lands and relegated to inferior social and economic positions. The new settlers, predominantly Protestant, formed a privileged colonial elite with close ties to England. Between these groups lay a gulf of religious difference, cultural misunderstanding, and mutual suspicion. Religious conflict intensified these divisions. The English Reformation had been imposed on Ireland with little regard for the wishes of its population, which remained overwhelmingly Catholic. Anti-Catholic legislation, modeled on English precedents but applied more rigorously in Ireland, restricted the rights of Catholics to hold office, practice law, receive education, or worship freely. Catholic clergy were forced underground, celebrating Mass in secret locations and living under constant threat of arrest, deportation, or execution. The economic policies of the English administration further transformed Irish society. Traditional Gaelic patterns of land tenure and inheritance were replaced by English common law. Communal landholding gave way to individual ownership. Agricultural practices were altered to supply English markets with beef, butter, and grain. Urban centers grew as centers of English administration and commerce, often excluding the native Irish from their economic opportunities. In this context of colonization and conflict, the small port of Baltimore occupied a peculiar position. Located on the southwestern coast of County Cork, Baltimore was part of the territory that had been confiscated during the Munster Plantation following the Desmond rebellions of the 1570s and 1580s. The land had been granted to Sir Thomas Crooke, an English entrepreneur who established a colony of Protestant settlers there in 1605. These were not aristocrats or soldiers, but ordinary working people seeking economic opportunity in a new land. Crooke envisioned Baltimore as a center for the lucrative pilchard fishing industry. He recruited settlers from England, particularly from the West Country, who brought with them expertise in fishing and processing fish for export markets. By 1608, the settlement had received a royal charter granting it borough status with the right to elect 2 members to the Irish Parliament. Crooke's colony appeared to be thriving, with a population of about 100 English settlers and a smaller number of native Irish who worked for them. But Baltimore's prosperity attracted unwanted attention. Its fishing fleet operated in waters frequented by pirates and privateers of various nations. Reports suggest that some Baltimore vessels engaged in piracy themselves, or at least traded with pirates who operated along the Irish coast. Sir Thomas Crooke himself was investigated for allegedly colluding with pirates, though he died in 1610 before proceedings could be completed. This reputation for lawlessness may have marked Baltimore in the minds of those who trafficked in maritime intelligence. The village of Baltimore in 1631 was modest in size but strategically significant, consisted of perhaps 40-50 houses clustered around a natural harbor, with excellent access to rich fishing grounds. The houses were simple structures of stone and timber, designed for functionality rather than comfort. The village was dominated by the remains of Dun na Sead, Fort of the Jewels, an ancient castle that had belonged to the O'Driscoll clan before being appropriated by the English settlers. Daily life in Baltimore revolved around the sea. The men spent most days fishing from small boats, while women and children processed the catch for preservation. Pilchards, a type of sardine, were the main catch, salted and packed in barrels for export to continental Europe. The work was hard, but potentially profitable. allowing the settlers to establish a modest but sustainable community. Their Protestant faith, English language, and customs set them apart from the surrounding Irish population. The relationship between the English settlers of Baltimore and the native Irish of the surrounding countryside was complex. The settlers depended on local Irish labor for various tasks, particularly during the busy fishing season. Some Irish families lived on the margins of the settlement, working as servants or laborers. Others remained in the countryside, farming under increasingly difficult conditions as traditional lands were enclosed and traditional practices restricted. Religion created a fundamental divide. The settlers were staunchly Protestant, viewing their Catholic neighbors with suspicion and sometimes contempt. The Irish, for their part, resented the presence of these foreigners on land that had once belonged to their own people. They maintained their Catholic faith in defiance of legal restrictions, attending Mass in secret locations and supporting priests who ministered at great personal risk. This religious division reinforced other cultural and economic differences, creating a society fractured along multiple lines. The political situation in Ireland in 1631 was relatively stable but tense. The Lord Deputy, representing the English crown, governed from Dublin Castle with the support of a small standing army and local militia forces. The Irish Parliament, dominated by Protestant landowners, enacted legislation that further entrenched colonial interests. Catholic resistance, having been crushed militarily in the 9 Years' War, had shifted to more subtle forms of non-cooperation and passive resistance. For the settlers of Baltimore, life on Ireland's remote southwestern coast offered both opportunities and dangers. Their distance from centers of power gave them a degree of autonomy, but also left them vulnerable. Dublin was over 200 miles away by road, a journey of several days through difficult terrain. The nearest substantial English garrison was at Kinsale, some 30 miles to the east. In practical terms, Baltimore was largely left to fend for itself in matters of local governance and defense. This vulnerability was compounded by the settlement's coastal location. The southwestern coast of Ireland is deeply indented with numerous bays, inlets, and natural harbors. This geography made it ideal for fishing, but also notoriously difficult to defend against maritime threats. The coastline was too extensive to patrol effectively, and the numerous hidden coves provided perfect hiding places for vessels with hostile intent. Baltimore itself had a natural harbor that, while excellent for the fishing fleet, also offered easy access to potential attackers. The defensive arrangements for Baltimore reflected these realities. The village had no formal fortifications beyond the partly ruined castle. There was no garrison of regular troops, relying instead on the settlers themselves to provide defense through a local militia. Coastal watchtowers, a common feature of Mediterranean shores long accustomed to corsair raids, were absent from this part of Ireland. The settlers' experience had taught them to fear storms and shipwrecks rather than human attackers from distant shores. This complacency was understandable. While piracy was a known threat in Irish waters, it typically targeted shipping rather than coastal settlements. The idea that corsairs from North Africa might venture so far north to raid an obscure Irish fishing village would have seemed far-fetched to most inhabitants of Baltimore. Their attention was focused on more immediate concerns: the weather, the fishing, the complex relationships with their Irish neighbors, and the economic challenges of their marginal existence. The political authorities in Dublin shared this lack of concern for potential corsair attacks. The English administration was preoccupied with maintaining control over a restive population and implementing the plantation policy. Coastal defense was a low priority, particularly for remote settlements like Baltimore. What naval forces England maintained in Irish waters were primarily concerned with preventing Spanish intrusion or suppressing local piracy, not defending against North African corsairs. Yet, the very factors that made Baltimore seem an unlikely target also made it attractive to someone like Murat Reis. Its remoteness meant a raid could be conducted with minimal risk of encountering naval opposition. Its small size meant it could be overwhelmed quickly by a determined force. Its population of English Protestants made it both ideologically acceptable as a target for Islamic corsairs and potentially valuable, as English captives generally commanded higher ransoms than Irish Catholics. The intelligence gathering that preceded corsair raids was sophisticated and thorough. Murat Reis likely had detailed information about Baltimore before planning his attack. This could have come from various sources: captured sailors, trading contacts in European ports, or even deliberate reconnaissance. There are hints in historical records that the corsairs may have received specific intelligence about Baltimore from someone with local knowledge, possibly a disaffected Irish Catholic with a grudge against the English settlers. The summer of 1631 found Baltimore in its usual rhythm of activity. The fishing season was in full swing, with boats going out daily to check their nets and process the catch. The village was probably at its most populous, with seasonal workers augmenting the permanent population. The long days of early summer meant extended working hours, with exhausted villagers retiring early to rest before another day of labor. This pattern of predictable activity made the settlement especially vulnerable to a carefully planned night attack. The domestic arrangements of Baltimore households reflected their working-class English origins. Families typically lived in simple two-room dwellings, with parents and younger children sharing one room, while older children and perhaps servants occupied the other. Furnishings were basic: wooden tables and stools, straw mattresses on simple bedsteads, cooking utensils, and perhaps a few cherished possessions brought from England. These modest households had little to tempt raiders interested in material plunder, but their human inhabitants represented a valuable commodity in the slave markets of North Africa. The people of Baltimore in 1631 represented a cross-section of working-class English society transplanted to Irish soil. Most were ordinary fishing families, with men working the boats while women managed households and processed the catch. There were also craftsmen, essential to the fishing industry: coopers to make barrels, blacksmiths to forge and repair tools, carpenters to build and maintain boats. A few merchants handled the export of fish and import of necessary supplies. The community was likely led by a small group of more prosperous settlers who had invested in boats and equipment. Among these settlers were individuals whose names would be recorded for posterity only because of the disaster about to befall them. The Bennets, the Harrises, the Chamberlains, and other families who had come to Baltimore seeking a better life would soon find themselves torn from this community and transported to an unimaginable existence on the far side of Europe. Their individual stories, pieced together from fragmentary records, offer glimpses of the human dimension of an event usually recounted in impersonal terms. As June 1631 approached, there were no apparent signs of the impending catastrophe. If there were unusual movements of ships off the coast, they went unreported or unheeded. If there were warnings from other coastal communities about suspicious vessels, they did not reach Baltimore in time. The settlers continued their daily routines, unaware that they had been marked as targets by corsair raiders operating thousands of miles from their North African bases. The stage was thus set for a collision between two worlds: the expanding sphere of Barbary corsair activity and the vulnerable colonial outpost on Ireland's southwestern coast. The attack that followed would shock contemporaries with its audacity, traumatize survivors with its brutality, and enter Irish folklore as a symbol of the precariousness of human existence in a world of unpredictable dangers. For the people of Baltimore, the night of June 19/20, 1631, would bring a swift and violent end to their community, and the beginning of an ordeal that few would survive. The the village of Baltimore slept peacefully on the night of June 19th, 1631. The summer solstice had just passed, and the long days of midsummer had exhausted the hard-working fishing community. Most villagers had retired early, their windows open to catch the mild sea breeze. Some may have noticed the unusual stillness of the night, the absence of wind that would normally rustle through the nearby trees. Few would have registered the significance of this calm weather, perfect conditions for raiders approaching silently from the sea. Out in the darkness of roaring Water Bay, two ships glided quietly toward the sleeping village. These were the vessels of Murat Reis and his corsair fleet, navigating carefully through unfamiliar waters. Their approach was deliberate and methodical, the result of careful planning and intelligence gathering. The corsairs had chosen the darkest part of the night, shortly before the moon rose, to make their final approach. Their ships, with muffled oars and minimal lanterns, presented almost no silhouette against the night sky. Murat Reis had selected his target with care. Baltimore offered several advantages for a successful raid. Its natural harbor allowed ships to approach closely without risk of grounding. The village was compact, with houses clustered near the waterfront for easy access to fishing boats. There were no substantial fortifications to overcome, and no regular garrison to offer organized resistance. Most crucially, the settlement was isolated, with the nearest substantial English presence at Kinsale, too far away to respond to a nighttime attack. The corsair force numbered approximately 230 men, a mix of Algerians, Turks, Dutch renegades, and European converts to Islam. They were well armed with muskets, curved scimitars, and short boarding axes. Many wore light armor, protection against the desperate resistance they anticipated. These were experienced raiders who had conducted similar operations along the Mediterranean coasts and increasingly into the Atlantic. They operated with a disciplined efficiency born of practice and the knowledge that their own survival depended on swift, coordinated action. Their leader, Murat Reis, remained aboard his flagship to coordinate the operation. Now in his 60s, the Dutch-born corsair captain was a veteran of countless raids. He had risen from captured privateer to admiral of the Salé fleet through a combination of nautical skill, tactical acumen, and ruthless efficiency. This raid on Baltimore represented perhaps his most audacious venture, striking deeper into northern European waters than any corsair fleet had previously attempted. Success would bring wealth, prestige, and confirmation of his reputation as the most feared corsair captain of his generation. The raiders deployed from their ships in smaller boats, landing at several points along the village shoreline. They moved silently in groups of 10 to 20 men, their feet wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of their approach. The first targets were the few sentries who might raise the alarm. These were quickly overwhelmed and silenced. With the approaches secured, the main force assembled at the edge of the village, dividing into smaller groups with assigned sectors to ensure no house was overlooked. The attack itself began with shocking suddenness. At a signal from their leaders, the raiders unleashed blood-curdling war cries and charged into the village. Doors were smashed open with heavy rams or axes. Torches were lit, casting a hellish glow over the scene and adding to the confusion and terror. The few villagers who had still been awake had no time to organize any defense. Most were seized in their beds, awakening to the terrifying sight of armed strangers in their homes. The corsairs employed tactics refined through long experience. They knew that panic and confusion were their allies, that a stunned population would offer less resistance than one given time to organize. They moved quickly from house to house, breaking down doors and dragging occupants from their beds. Men who resisted were cut down immediately, pour encourager les sort. Women who screamed were silenced with blows or gags. Children were snatched from their parents, both to control the adults and because young captives were particularly valuable in the slave markets. In some houses, entire families were captured intact. The Bennets, with their 5 children ranging from infants to teenagers, were among the first taken. William Ball, a prosperous boat owner, was seized along with his wife and their young daughter. Stephen Broadabrook, the village cooper, was taken with his pregnant wife. The raiders showed a methodical thoroughness, searching each house for hidden occupants and gathering their captives in the village center under heavy guard. Not all the villagers were caught in the initial sweep. Some, awakened by the commotion, managed to hide in cellars, attics, or outbuildings. Others fled into the surrounding countryside, racing toward neighboring settlements to spread the alarm. A few men attempted to fight back with fishing knives, boat hooks, or whatever implements came to hand. Their resistance was futile against the well-armed raiders and typically ended in death rather than capture. The corsairs preferred living captives who could be sold, but they did not hesitate to kill those who posed a threat. The attack focused primarily on the English settlement, largely bypassing the old castle and the small cluster of Irish dwellings on the village outskirts. This selectivity has fueled suspicions that the raiders had specific intelligence about the village layout and population. Contemporary accounts suggest that the corsairs were guided to specific houses known to contain the most valuable potential captives. This targeting indicates prior reconnaissance, or, more controversially, assistance from someone with intimate knowledge of the settlement. The most compelling suspect for such collaboration was Hackett, a local pilot familiar with the treacherous coastline around Baltimore. Contemporary sources allege that Hackett had guided the corsair ships to Baltimore, either out of greed for the promised reward or from animosity toward the English settlers. Some accounts claim he had a personal grudge against specific villagers. As an Irish Catholic in a region dominated by English Protestants, Hackett would have had ample reason to resent the colonial presence. Whether his alleged betrayal was motivated by religion, politics, or simple avarice remains a subject of historical debate. The raid lasted less than 2 hours from start to finish. By the standards of the time, it was a masterpiece of planning and execution. The corsairs achieved complete surprise, neutralized what little resistance emerged, and withdrew with minimal casualties to their own force. They gathered their captives at the village center, binding them with ropes and dividing them into groups for transportation back to the ships. The villagers, dazed with shock and terror, offered little resistance at this stage. Many were injured from rough handling during capture, and all were disoriented by the sudden catastrophe that had befallen their community. The selection of captives followed patterns established in Mediterranean raids. Young men were the most prized for their labor value and higher ransom potential. Women, particularly younger ones, were taken for domestic service or harems. Children were valuable as they could be raised in the Muslim faith and trained for various roles. The elderly and infirm, having less value in the slave markets, were sometimes left behind. The raiders also showed a preference for those who appeared more prosperous, judging by their clothing and household goods, as they might command higher ransoms. The precise number of captives taken has been variously reported as between 100 and 109. The most commonly cited figure is 107, which appears in contemporary accounts and official reports. This represented, virtually, the entire English population of Baltimore, effectively wiping out the settlement in a single night. The captives included men, women, and children of all ages, from infants to the elderly. Families were kept together during the initial capture, but would later be separated according to the needs of the slave markets. As dawn approached, the raiders began their withdrawal. The captives were marched to the waiting boats, still bound and now gagged to prevent screaming that might alert nearby settlements. The boats made multiple trips between shore and ships, transporting their human cargo. The corsairs maintained strict discipline during this vulnerable phase of the operation. with armed guards watching both the captives and the approaches to the village. By first light, the last boat had left the shore, and the corsair ships were preparing to depart. The scene they left behind was one of devastation. Several houses had been burned, either deliberately or from unattended torches. Bodies lay in the streets and doorways, primarily men who had resisted or tried to protect their families. Possessions were scattered where they had been tossed aside during searches for hidden valuables or occupants. The few survivors emerged cautiously from hiding places as the sound of oars faded, confronting a village transformed in a few hours from peaceful community to charnel house. The ships of Murat Reis departed as quickly as they had arrived, taking advantage of the morning breeze to clear the coast before any pursuit could be organized. They left behind a few small boats to maintain watch, ensuring no English naval vessels were approaching. The corsair fleet initially sailed southwest, a direction that confused later pursuers, before turning south toward their North African bases. This indirect route was a standard corsair tactic to evade pursuit and avoid the heavily patrolled shipping lanes closer to major European ports. Aboard the corsair vessels, the captives faced the beginning of an ordeal that would last years, or, for most, a lifetime. They were confined below decks in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Men were typically chained to prevent revolt, while women and children were granted slightly more freedom of movement. Food was minimal, water strictly rationed. Disease spread quickly in these conditions, claiming the first victims of captivity before the ships even reached North African waters. The psychological trauma was perhaps even greater than the physical hardship. These were people who had likely never ventured far from the British Isles, suddenly torn from their homes and facing an uncertain fate in a distant land. They had witnessed the killing of friends and neighbors, the destruction of their community, and now faced separation from family members at the slave auctions. Most had probably never encountered Muslims before and knew of Islam only through hostile church teachings. Their terror was compounded by ignorance of what awaited them. Meanwhile, the alarm had spread through the neighboring settlements. By mid-morning, riders had reached Skibbereen and other nearby communities with news of the attack. Local militia forces began to assemble, but they were too few and too late to mount an effective pursuit. The corsair ships were already over the horizon, beyond the reach of the small boats available to local authorities. The riders continued to Kinsale and eventually to Cork, where more substantial English forces were stationed. But even these could not respond quickly enough to intercept the raiders. Reports of the Baltimore raid reached Dublin within days, causing shock and alarm at the highest levels of the English administration. The Lord Deputy, Viscount Wentworth, later Earl of Strafford, recognized the political implications of such a brazen attack on English settlers. His correspondence reveals both genuine concern for the captives and anxiety about the damage to English prestige. The failure to protect a chartered settlement from foreign raiders represented a significant embarrassment for a government already struggling to maintain control over a restive Ireland. In England, news of the raid reached London approximately 2 weeks later. The reaction was one of outrage and calls for retribution. The attack was portrayed in pamphlets and broadsheets as an assault on Protestant Englishmen by Muslim heathens, with lurid descriptions of the presumed fate awaiting the captives. Some publications linked the raid to broader anxieties about the declining power of England in European affairs under Charles I. Others used it to argue for increased naval expenditure and more aggressive policies against the Barbary states. The English government's response was hampered by practical limitations. The Navy Royal, predecessor to the Royal Navy, was undergoing a period of neglect and retrenchment under Charles I. Its ships were few, often in poor repair, and committed to other pressing duties. The distances involved made pursuit of the corsairs impractical, especially given the raiders' head start. Instead, diplomatic efforts were initiated to secure the captives' release through negotiation and ransom, a process that would drag on for years with limited success. Investigations into the raid focused heavily on the question of local collaboration. Hackett, the alleged guide, was quickly arrested and brought to trial in Cork. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial, based on his known familiarity with the coastline and alleged contacts with the corsairs. Nevertheless, he was found guilty and executed. His body hung in chains near the entrance to Baltimore Harbor, as a warning to others who might consider aiding raiders. Some historians have questioned whether Hackett was truly guilty or simply a convenient scapegoat. His Irish Catholic background made him an easy target for authorities eager to deflect blame from their own negligence in coastal defense. The speed of his trial and execution suggests a desire to close the matter quickly rather than pursue a thorough investigation. Alternative theories propose that the corsairs may have gained their intelligence from captured sailors or trading contacts, rather than local collaborators. For the surviving residents of Baltimore and those who had escaped capture, the aftermath of the raid brought difficult decisions. Some chose to abandon the settlement entirely, relocating to more secure communities inland or returning to England. Others stayed, rebuilding their homes and attempting to reconstruct their community. But Baltimore never fully recovered from the raid. Its population remained depleted, its prosperity diminished. The psychological impact lingered for generations, with the night of June 20th, 1631, entering local folklore as a symbol of sudden, devastating misfortune. As the corsair ships sailed south with their human cargo, they left behind a community shattered beyond repair and a mystery that continues to intrigue historians. The Baltimore raid stands as one of the most dramatic episodes in the long history of conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. A moment when the distant threat of Barbary corsairs suddenly became terrifyingly immediate for a small Irish fishing village. For the captives bound for North African slave markets, it marked the beginning of an ordeal that would transform their lives in ways they could scarcely imagine. The voyage from Baltimore to North Africa was the first ordeal of many for the Irish captives. The journey typically took 2 to 3 weeks, depending on winds and whether the corsair ships made additional raids along the way. Confined below decks, in cramped, airless holds, the prisoners endured conditions that claimed the lives of the weakest before they even reached African shores. The summer heat of the Mediterranean made the holds unbearably hot. Fresh water was strictly rationed, and food consisted of hard biscuits and dried meat of dubious quality. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, was particularly common and deadly. Fever claimed others, sweeping through the crowded captives with devastating efficiency. The corsairs made minimal efforts to tend to the sick, knowing that a certain percentage of their human cargo would inevitably be lost during transport. Their calculations factored in this attrition when planning raids, capturing more people than they expected to deliver to the slave markets. The psychological impact of the journey was equally devastating. Families who had been captured together were frequently separated when loading the ships, husbands from wives, parents from children. Those who remained together had little privacy or comfort to offer one another. The captives spoke no Arabic or Turkish and could not communicate with their captors except through crude gestures. Rumors spread among them about their ultimate fate, each more terrifying than the last, fueled by half-remembered stories about the Barbary Turks that had circulated in European folklore. For the Baltimore captives, their first sight of North Africa came as Murad Reis's ships approached the Moroccan coast. Some accounts suggest they were first taken to Salé, on Morocco's Atlantic coast, where Murad Reis maintained his primary base of operations. Others indicate they sailed directly to Algiers, the largest and most sophisticated slave market in the Barbary states. The discrepancy may reflect a division of the captives, with some remaining in Morocco, while others continued to Algiers for sale. Algiers in 1631 was a thriving city of perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, its prosperity built largely on maritime raiding and the slave trade. Dominated by its whitewashed buildings rising in tiers from the harbor, the city presented an intimidating spectacle to European captives. Its defenses were formidable, with massive walls and hundreds of cannon facing the sea to deter punitive expeditions by European powers. The harbor itself was protected by the massive Pennon, a fortress built by the Spanish and captured by the Ottomans a century earlier. The arrival of corsair ships with new captives was a routine occurrence in Algiers, happening several times a month during the summer raiding season. Local officials met the ships as they docked, assessing the human cargo and calculating the state's share of the proceeds. By long-standing custom, the Dey of Algiers had the right to select 1/8 of all captives for the state's service, typically choosing the strongest men for the galleys or public construction projects. The corsair captains and their crews divided the remainder according to pre-arranged shares. Before being sold, the captives were prepared for market. They were cleaned, their wounds treated superficially, and provided with minimal clothing if their own had been too badly damaged during capture or transit. Men's beards were trimmed, women's hair arranged to enhance their appearance. This preparation was purely commercial, designed to increase the captive's market value rather than from any humanitarian concern. The corsairs were, after all, selling a product, and presentation mattered in maximizing profit. The slave market itself was located near the harbor, a grim courtyard surrounded by galleries where buyers could observe without mingling with the merchandise. Sales occurred shortly after arrival, usually within a day or two, to minimize the corsairs' costs in feeding and housing the captives. The Baltimore prisoners would have been displayed in groups organized by age, gender, and apparent value. Buyers moved among them, examining them like livestock, checking teeth and muscles, looking for signs of disease or weakness, and assessing their potential value for various forms of labor. For the Baltimore captives, this experience was profoundly dehumanizing. Stripped of clothing, examined intimately by strangers, unable to understand the language around them, they were reduced to the status of animals at market. Families who had remained together until this point were finally separated as they were sold to different buyers. Parents watched helplessly as their children were led away, spouses were separated perhaps forever, and the community that had sustained them in Baltimore was irrevocably shattered. The price commanded by each captive varied widely based on several factors. Young men in good physical condition brought the highest prices, typically between 100 and 300 Spanish dollars, a substantial sum in the 17th century. Women generally sold for less unless they were young and attractive, in which case they might command premium prices for domestic service in wealthy households or harems. Children were valued for their potential rather than immediate utility, selling for modest sums, but considered good investments as they could be trained and acculturated more easily than adults. The Baltimore captives faced divergent fates depending on who purchased them. Those selected by the Dey for state service faced the harshest conditions. Men assigned to the galleys endured a brutal existence, chained to oars and forced to row for hours under the threat of overseers' whips. Few survived more than a few years of this treatment. Those assigned to construction projects fared slightly better, but still endured harsh physical labor in the North African heat, building and maintaining the city's extensive fortifications. Captives, purchased by private individuals, experienced varied conditions depending on their owners and assigned roles. Some became domestic servants in urban households, a relatively favored position, offering adequate food, shelter, and less physically demanding work. Others were purchased by craftsmen who needed labor for workshops producing textiles, leather goods, or metalwork. Those bought by rural landowners faced agricultural labor on farms outside the city, often in conditions of extreme heat and minimal supervision. Women from Baltimore confronted particular vulnerabilities. Young women were sought for domestic service in wealthy households, but faced the constant threat of sexual exploitation. Contemporary accounts of female captives emphasize their fear of being forced into harems or concubinage. While some European women did indeed end up in such situations, historical evidence suggests this was less common than European captivity narratives implied. More typically, women were employed as household servants, cooks, or nurses for children, though always under conditions that offered little protection from abuse. Children adapted most readily to captivity, quickly learning Arabic or Turkish and adopting local customs. Young boys were often trained in trades, serving as apprentices to artisans or merchants. Girls were incorporated into households as domestic servants, learning local customs of food preparation, cleaning, and childcare. For many of these children, memories of Ireland and their former lives would fade with time. Some would eventually convert to Islam, either under pressure or as a means of improving their circumstances, becoming fully integrated into North African society. The issue of religious conversion loomed large in the experience of all the captives. Islamic law distinguished between Muslim and non-Muslim slaves, with Muslims theoretically protected from enslavement. This created a powerful incentive for conversion, as those who embraced Islam could expect improved treatment and the possibility of eventual manumission. For the captors, the conversion of Christian captives represented a spiritual victory as significant as the economic gain from their enslavement. For the captives, conversion presented an agonizing dilemma. Maintaining their Christian faith might preserve a sense of identity and the moral support of European redemption efforts. Conversion could improve their immediate circumstances, but meant abandoning their religious identity and potentially severing ties with their homeland. Contemporary Christian accounts emphasize the heroic resistance of captives who refused to convert despite torture or inducements. But the reality was more nuanced. Many captives pragmatically adopted outward conformity to Islam while maintaining their Christian faith privately. Some captives achieved positions of surprising influence and comfort through conversion and demonstrated skill. The phenomenon of European renegades who rose to prominence in barbarous society was well established by 1631. Murat Reis himself was the most prominent example, having risen from Dutch captive to admiral of the Salé Corsair fleet. While none of the Baltimore captives are recorded as achieving comparable status, some undoubtedly found niches that afforded them better conditions than their initial enslavement had suggested. The English government's response to the Baltimore raid was hampered by practical and political limitations. Officially, English policy prohibited the payment of ransoms to pirate states, on the grounds that this would only encourage further attacks. In practice, families with means were allowed to arrange private ransoms for their relatives, working through established intermediaries in Mediterranean ports. Few of the Baltimore settlers had such resources or connections, leaving them dependent on official or charitable efforts for redemption. King Charles I, preoccupied with mounting political tensions at home that would eventually lead to civil war, showed limited interest in the plight of a few dozen commoners from a remote Irish settlement. The naval force necessary to threaten Algiers into releasing captives was beyond England's capabilities at that time. Instead, diplomatic approaches were made through England's consul in Algiers, who had limited leverage and could secure the release of only a few high-value captives through negotiation. Religious organizations played a more active role in redemption efforts. The Trinitarian Order, founded specifically for the ransoming of Christian captives, maintained a presence in Algiers and other Barbary ports, working with limited funds raised through charitable donations across Europe. They prioritized captives based on vulnerability, length of captivity, and risk of conversion. The Order's records suggest they managed to redeem some Baltimore captives in the years following the raid, though the exact number remains unclear. The process of redemption was complicated and uncertain. Once a captive had been selected for potential ransom, negotiations began over price, typically 2 to 10 times the original purchase price, depending on the captive's perceived value. Funds had to be transferred through complex financial networks spanning multiple countries. The captive then had to be located and transported to the port, a process that could take months if they had been sold to an owner in the interior. At any point, the deal might collapse due to changed circumstances, leaving the captive in limbo. For those Baltimore captives fortunate enough to be ransomed, the journey home presented further challenges. They typically traveled aboard merchant vessels to Mediterranean ports, like Livorno or Marseille, then overland through France to Channel ports, and finally by sea to England or Ireland. The entire journey could take months and expose the former captives to new dangers from disease, bandits, or unscrupulous transporters. Those who finally reached home often arrived destitute, having lost everything in their captivity. Documented cases of Baltimore captives who returned to Ireland or England are few. One account mentions a woman who was ransomed after 3 years and returned to Cork, where she reported the survival of several other former neighbors still in captivity. Another describes a man who returned after 8 years, having worked as a gardener for a wealthy merchant in Algiers. He had learned Arabic and provided valuable information about the conditions of other captives and the city's defenses, which was duly reported to English authorities, always hungry for intelligence about potential enemies. The vast majority of the Baltimore captives never returned to Ireland. Some died during the initial voyage or in the harsh conditions of their early captivity. Others lived out their lives as slaves, perhaps eventually achieving some limited status through skill or conversion, but never regaining their freedom. A significant number, particularly those taken as children, assimilated into North African society, converting to Islam, learning local languages, adopting local customs, and eventually disappearing from European records. For those who remained in captivity, adaptation became a necessary survival strategy. Learning Arabic or Turkish opened possibilities for better positions and treatment. Understanding local customs and religious practices helped avoid unintentional offense that might result in punishment. Building relationships with owners, fellow slaves, or free Muslims could provide crucial protection and support. Over time, even without formal conversion, many captives developed a syncretic religious practice that incorporated elements of both Christianity and Islam. Letters from captivity provide rare glimpses into this process of adaptation and the complex emotions it entailed. In one surviving letter, attributed to a Baltimore captive, though its authenticity is debated, a woman writes to her brother in England, describing her life as a household servant to a merchant's family. She mentions learning to prepare local foods, wearing local dress, and developing a functional understanding of Arabic. While lamenting her separation from home and family, she also notes that her treatment is not as harsh as she had feared, and that she has found small consolations in her new circumstances. The impact of the Baltimore raid extended beyond the individual tragedies of the captives. It highlighted the vulnerability of coastal communities throughout northwestern Europe and prompted increased defensive measures. Watchtowers were built along vulnerable coastlines, local militia forces were better organized and equipped, and naval patrols were increased. These measures came too late for Baltimore, but provided some protection for other communities that might otherwise have suffered similar fates. For the captives themselves, we can only imagine the complex mixture of despair, resilience, and adaptation that characterized their lives in North Africa. Torn from everything familiar, they faced choices no person should have to make between physical survival and spiritual identity, between hopeless resistance and pragmatic accommodation. Their stories, largely lost to history, except in fragmentary records and folkloric memory, represent one of the more poignant chapters in the long history of cultural contact and conflict across the Mediterranean world. The immediate aftermath of the Baltimore raid was devastation. What had been a thriving fishing community became almost overnight a place of ghosts and bitter memories. The few survivors who had hidden during the attack emerged to find their village in ruins, their neighbors gone, the normal rhythms of life shattered beyond repair. Those who had escaped by fleeing inland returned to empty houses and unanswerable questions about the fate of loved ones. The community that Sir Thomas Crook had established with such optimism barely a generation earlier now lay in tatters. Within weeks of the raid, many of the surviving inhabitants had abandoned Baltimore entirely. Some returned to England, seeking the security of familiar surroundings and family connections. Others relocated to larger Irish towns like Kinsale or Cork, where defensive arrangements offered better protection against coastal raiders. The exodus left Baltimore severely depopulated, its harbor largely empty of the fishing boats that had been its economic lifeblood. Fields lay untended, houses uninhabited, the economic infrastructure of the community collapsing without the human capital to maintain it. For those who chose to remain, life was transformed by fear. Watchtowers were hastily constructed on the headlands around the harbor, manned day and night by local men taking shifts as lookouts. No boat could approach without scrutiny, no stranger arrive without interrogation. The remaining fishing fleet ventured out only in daylight hours and stayed within sight of shore, severely limiting the catch. After sunset, the village retreated behind barred doors, the open community spirit of earlier years, replaced by a fortress mentality born of traumatic experience. The raid had profound implications for English settlement policy in Ireland. The vulnerability of isolated Protestant communities in predominantly Catholic regions became a pressing concern for authorities in Dublin. The Lord Deputy, Viscount Wentworth, directed local officials to assess the defenses of coastal settlements and recommend improvements. In some cases, this led to the construction of small forts or the stationing of regular troops in previously undefended communities. The policy of plantation continued, but with greater attention to security considerations and the clustering of settler populations for mutual protection. The Baltimore raid also influenced naval policy. While England lacked the resources for a punitive expedition against Algiers, efforts were made to improve coastal patrols around Ireland. Additional ships were assigned to the Irish Sea and the approaches to the Bristol Channel, though these remained inadequate to the enormous task of securing hundreds of miles of indented coastline. Naval commanders received explicit orders to pursue and engage corsair vessels if encountered, a more aggressive stance than the primarily defensive posture previously adopted. For English and Irish authorities, the raid raised troubling questions about internal security. The widespread belief that Hackett had guided the corsairs to Baltimore highlighted the potential for disaffected locals to collaborate with external enemies. This suspicion fell particularly heavily on the Catholic population, already viewed with distrust by the Protestant administration. In the years following the raid, Catholic communities near the coast faced increased surveillance and restrictions on movement, especially during periods of international tension, when corsair activity was expected to increase. Throughout Europe, news of the Baltimore raid caused both shock and a certain grim fascination. That Barbary corsairs could strike so far north, against a target so remote from their usual hunting grounds, emphasized the reach of their maritime power. Other coastal communities in France, Spain, and the Low Countries reassessed their vulnerability and strengthened defenses. The raid became a cautionary tale, recounted to emphasize the need for vigilance and the dangers of complacency in the face of distant threats. The response from the Barbary states themselves was unsurprisingly triumphant. For Murat Reis, the Baltimore raid represented the pinnacle of a long career of maritime raiding. His successful return to Algiers, with over 100 captives, enhanced his reputation and wealth. The Dey of Algiers, who received a substantial share of the proceeds, publicly celebrated the raid as evidence of Muslim power projecting into the heart of Christian Europe. In diplomatic exchanges with European powers, Barbary rulers cited Baltimore as proof of their reach and a reason for European states to continue paying tribute for protection. Over time, the memory of the Baltimore raid entered the realm of folklore and literature. In Irish oral tradition, the story was preserved with a mixture of historical accuracy and mythological embellishment. It became one of many tales illustrating the vulnerability of coastal communities to external threats, a theme that resonated deeply in a nation surrounded by sea. The story acquired supernatural elements in some tellings, with omens preceding the raid or divine retribution following it. In others, it became entwined with narratives of betrayal and collaboration, reflecting historic tensions between native Irish and English settlers. The most famous literary treatment of the raid came 2 centuries later, with Thomas Davis's poem, The Sack of Baltimore, published in 1844. Davis, a key figure in the Young Ireland movement promoting Irish nationalism, used the historical event as a vehicle for contemporary political messaging. His poem emphasized the vulnerability of Ireland when divided by internal conflicts and the need for unity against external threats. The opening lines set a tone of impending doom that captured the sudden violence of the historical event. The summer sun is falling soft on Carbery's 100 Isles. The summer sun is gleaming still through Gabriel's rough defiles. Old Inishurkin's crumbled fane looks like a malting bird, and in a calm and sleepy swell, the ocean tide is heard. Davis's poem took significant liberties with historical facts, blending the Baltimore raid with elements of other corsair attacks and embellishing details for dramatic effect. He portrayed the captives as primarily native Irish rather than English settlers, a deliberate distortion that served his nationalist narrative. Despite these inaccuracies, the poem became the primary vehicle through which the Baltimore raid entered wider cultural memory, its vivid imagery and emotional power ensuring its place in Irish literary anthologies. Visual representations of the raid appeared in the 19th century, when Orientalist themes became popular in European art. Paintings depicted idealized scenes of corsair ships approaching the Irish coast, or captives being led through exotic North African slave markets. These works reflected contemporary fascination with the Islamic world more than historical accuracy, projecting 19th century Orientalist fantasies onto the 17th century event. They nonetheless helped keep the memory of Baltimore alive in European cultural consciousness. Academic historians largely neglected the Baltimore raid until the late 20th century. Early historical accounts treated it as a footnote, a curious anomaly in the broader narrative of Anglo-Irish relations or European maritime history. This neglect reflected both the limited sources available and the raid's ambiguous position between established historical categories. It was neither a major battle nor a significant political event, falling instead into the cracks between military, maritime, social, and colonial history. The revival of scholarly interest came with the broader turn towards social history and the experiences of ordinary people. Historians recognize the Baltimore raid as a compelling example of how global conflicts could impact isolated communities, how large-scale processes like imperial competition and religious conflict manifested in individual lives. The raid also offered insights into the complex religious and cultural interactions of the early modern Mediterranean world, challenging simplistic narratives of Christian-Muslim relations. Archaeological investigations in both Baltimore and North Africa have added new dimensions to understanding the raid. Excavations at Baltimore have uncovered evidence of the village as it existed before the attack, including household items abandoned during the raid and signs of the destruction that accompanied it. In Algiers and other North African cities, archaeological work has illuminated the urban contexts in which European captives lived, the physical structures of slave markets, and the material culture of a society where European captives constituted a significant presence. The fate of Baltimore itself presents a study in resilience and adaptation. Though the village never regained its pre-raid population or prosperity during the 17th century, it was not permanently abandoned. Gradually, new settlers arrived, drawn by the same natural advantages that had attracted the original population: the sheltered harbor, access to fishing grounds, and fertile land. These newcomers included both English Protestants and Irish Catholics, the distinction becoming less rigid as time passed and memories of the raid faded. By the 18th century, Baltimore had re-established itself as a small fishing port and market center, though on a more modest scale than before. The physical traces of the raid had largely disappeared, absorbed into the normal processes of rebuilding and renovation that shape any long-inhabited place. The psychological impact lingered longer, with local traditions of keeping watch and maintaining defensive preparations persisting well beyond any realistic threat from Barbary corsairs. The modern village of Baltimore bears few visible reminders of the 1631 raid. A small plaque commemorates the event, and the ruins of Don Nasead Castle overlook the harbor much as they did when Murat Reis's ships appeared offshore. Local heritage centers and museums include the raid in their exhibitions, recognizing its significance in the area's history. Annual commemorations mark the anniversary, though these are relatively recent innovations rather than continuous traditions from the 17th century. For historians today, the Baltimore raid offers a window into several important aspects of early modern history. It illustrates the extensive reach of Mediterranean conflict networks, showing how tensions between Christian Europe and the Islamic world could manifest thousands of miles from their epicenter. It demonstrates the vulnerability of colonial outposts, not only to resistance from those they displaced, but to external threats exploiting their precarious position. And it reveals the human cost of large-scale political and religious conflicts, the individual tragedies hidden within grand historical narratives. The raid also provides a counterpoint to Eurocentric historical perspectives. From a North African viewpoint, the attack on Baltimore was not an act of unprovoked piracy, but a legitimate operation in an ongoing conflict. The corsairs saw themselves as Ghazis, warriors engaged in a just struggle against Christian powers that had themselves engaged in centuries of aggression against Muslim lands. Their raiding represented an inversion of power dynamics, bringing to European shores the insecurity that European naval power had long imposed on North African coastal communities. The captives taken from Baltimore became, willingly or not, cultural intermediaries between European and North African societies. Those who survived and adapted to life in North Africa acquired languages, skills, and perspectives that few Europeans of their era possessed. If any eventually returned to Europe, they brought with them knowledge that complicated simplistic views of the Islamic world. Those who remained in North Africa, especially children who grew to adulthood there, contributed European elements to the hybrid cultures of coastal cities like Algiers. This cross-cultural exchange, however brutally initiated, is part of a larger pattern of Mediterranean history. The sea that physically separated Europe, Africa, and Asia paradoxically connected them through networks of trade, conflict, and cultural exchange. People, goods, ideas, and technologies circulated through these networks, creating shared cultural spaces that transcended political and religious boundaries. The Baltimore captives, transported across this maritime world, participated involuntarily in these processes of exchange and hybridization. The Baltimore raid occurred at a particular historical moment when the balance of power in the Mediterranean was shifting. The Ottoman Empire had passed its zenith, but remained formidable. European states were developing the naval technologies and organizational structures that would eventually give them decisive advantage. North African corsair states exploited the interstices of this changing system, maintaining a degree of autonomy through maritime prowess and strategic alliance. The raid thus captures a moment of historical transition, when outcomes still hung in the balance. By the later 17th century, European naval power had begun to assert decisive superiority over the corsairs. The bombardment of Algiers by the French in 1682 and 1683 marked a turning point, demonstrating the vulnerability of even well-defended corsair bases to European firepower. By the 18th century, improved naval technology, more effective convoy systems, and better coastal defenses had significantly reduced the corsairs' reach and impact. The age of large-scale Barbary raiding was drawing to a close, though it would not completely end until the French conquest of Algiers in 1830. For the descendants of the Baltimore captives, if any could be identified, the raid represents a hidden chapter of family history. Genetic studies of North African populations reveal European ancestry in many families, particularly in coastal regions. Some of this genetic heritage undoubtedly derives from captives like those taken from Baltimore. Conversely, European families descended from ransomed captives may carry genetic or cultural influences from their ancestors' time in North Africa. These biological and cultural legacies persist long after the historical event itself has faded from memory. The sack of Baltimore thus stands as a reminder of history's complexity and interconnectedness. What appears at first glance as an isolated incident, a tragic footnote in Irish local history, reveals itself on closer examination as a node in vast networks of conflict, commerce, and cultural exchange. The raid and its aftermath encompassed multiple continents, diverse religious and political systems, and the intimate details of individual human lives. In its complexity and human impact, it exemplifies the challenge and reward of historical understanding, seeing both the grand patterns that shape human societies and the individual experiences that give those patterns meaning.